Act Out is 100% independent, non-corporatized activist news, and we need your help to keep acting out. To become a patron of the show, visit patreon.com/actout. This week on Act Out, you may not want to politicize mass shootings, but they, like everything else in this life, is already political. Adding on to last week's show on white male dethronement, Army veteran and community organizer Vince Emanuele joins us to take a look at the issue of America's violent culture and how it affects the entire political spectrum. And indeed, what that means for the left as we battle the empire. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. Unnoticed flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. As we stare down the aftermath of yet another mass shooting, another round of shoulder shrugs, and as The Onion so brilliantly put it, excuses as to why the only nation in the world suffering from this problem can't seem to find a way to fix it. The conversation of gun control is raised once again. And people on both sides of the aisle are asked just not to politicize politics. The politics of 4% of the world's population accounting for 43% of the world's private gun ownership. The politics of capitalism, indeed what we covered last week. The politics of dethroned white men. The politics of class warfare attacking en masse the one seemingly untouchable group of white men. The politics of white supremacy, white mortality, growing income inequality, dwindling access to physical and mental health care, the complete politics of life in this country. In other words, trying to extract politics from the issue of gun violence is like trying to extract policy from politics. It's a request made by the corporatist goons who want to make sure that their sales stay high and their shiny logos appear unblemished by the blood of thousands. It's a way to ensure that while talking heads condemn the shootings, violence remains an integral part of our culture, as stitched into the fiber of our society as blood red fibers in the flag. And while it may be more clear that our gun fetish leads us down a path of mass shootings, it might be less clear that our violence fetish distorts a real and necessary conversation also about popular dissent. This past week, I was in Cuba, and while an in-depth report on my time there will air next week, I felt it important to dive into a conversation that I had with war veteran and community organizer Vince Emanuele a while back. Because the image of a guerrilla, a dissident, a hero of the people with a gun in one hand, a raised fist, is something glorified all over the globe, not least of all in this hemisphere. Be it the Zapatistas' subcomandante Marcos, who famously said, "We got guns so people would listen, and then once they listened, we didn't need the guns," or Che in Cuba. Weapons have played an important role in populist uprisings. And with regards to the US, the fetishization of violence affects the far left and the far right, albeit very differently, seemingly without any real understanding of what a violent uprising would look like in this country. It's pretty easy to condemn mass shootings. It is far more difficult to condemn the underlying cancer that perpetuates them. Indeed, because that requires a condemnation of our society as a whole. A society that is deeply entrenched in not only violence, but the overarching capitalism and colonialism that violence is used to support. Such an empire is hard to change. And for those pontificating about a second revolution in this country, do we see past the romanticization? It's always easy to glorify revolutions without really understanding the violence they catalyze. And all that being said, does that mean that we should abstain? Does that mean that any gun ownership is bad gun ownership? That a community does not have the right to protect itself because of the fact that predominantly white men are lashing out at late stage capitalism in all the wrong ways? Does it mean that tactics involving weaponry should always be off the table? And if you're watching this thinking, wow, what a shitty time to bring this up, let me ask you, when would be a good time? Between which mass shootings would be a good time? When is it most convenient to discuss violence in this country, the downward spiral of an empire rife with gun culture and lacking all safety nets and networks? When is it a good time to talk candidly about what we want and what we're prepared to do to get it? And while I'll talk more about that last question next week in our conversation about Cuba, this week, right now, here is a special in depth conversation with war veteran and community organizer Vincent Emanuele on our culture of violence, the left's list of tactics, combat style preparation, and more. Take a look.
So I think like a lot of American men or boys, I grew up in a sort of hyper militarized, hyper violent context. You grew up playing guns, cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, and all the rest. So I think there is a certain level of propagandizing that takes place, a certain level of conditioning and dehumanization that takes place. As any young man, I think, or person really who grows up here, but I think it's specific to young men in this culture, the levels of patriarchy and violence and so forth, and this toxic masculinity that is produced by the mainstream media and our dominant culture here. So for me, joining the military, I guess, wasn't that out of the question or out of the ordinary for someone from my background, working class background, family, steel workers and iron workers and carpenters, and grew up in the Rust Belt and in a family where many people served in the military. And so I think there was a certain level of adventurism and also I think a certain fetishizing of violence that fits within that hypermasculine structure. And so that was, I think, really the impetus for me joining the Marine Corps. And then when I got to the Marine Corps, of course, my experiences were very, very negative and led me to, I went to Iraq twice on two different occasions. After my second deployment to Iraq as a combat infantryman with 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, I came home and refused to go on a third deployment. At the time, I found the war to be immoral. I was reading about the illegality of the war and came to the conclusion that I could no longer participate in the U.S. empire. And so I refused to do a third deployment, and I was subsequently discharged from the Marine Corps and immediately joined Iraq Veterans Against the War and Veterans for Peace.
So there is a lot of back and forth right now, in particular with the issue of violence, as you note in the article as well. Now you wrote, violence when employed correctly is extremely effective. That's why it's so tempting to use violence as a means to an end. People who argue that violence solves nothing have never encountered much violence. Unfortunately, violence is horrifically powerful and quite useful in many contexts. That said, the long-term social, ecological, and cultural consequences of violent behavior are equally destructive.
Right. So I'm thinking of violence in many different ways here. So I think if you take it down to, say, a subjective individual level, someone attacks you. The initial inclination is, of course, to defend yourself, and I think everyone should defend themselves. Then that can be taken to, say, a level of more extreme. Say there's someone who attacks you, and then say you come to the conclusion that, well, I want to kill this person because they assaulted me or whatever the case may be. I think there's repercussions for that, both on the personal, subjective level, what that does to an individual who's engaged in extreme violence. And throughout history, we can look, so there's more problems with PTSD among, say, U.S. soldiers who were involved in Vietnam than there were among the North Vietnamese who were fighting U.S. imperialists. But that's not to say that extreme violence didn't seriously infect the society and culture of the people who live in North Vietnam. So I think this is the same as I speak with my Iraqi friends and Iraqi refugees and so forth. They have an inherent right and I think a duty to oppose U.S. empire by any means necessary. But there is a certain cycle of violence that I think becomes the issue. If that means to an end doesn't have an end that is not violent, or if it doesn't have a broader strategy to stop this cycle of violence, then you can see how quickly and how easily things can escalate to a very cataclysmic situation, such as in Iraq. What also worries me is that being in the military, one of the things I learned, and for those who aren't aware, is that, when you're in the military, you don't pick up a weapon until 11 or 12 weeks into your military training. The kind of discipline, the kind of organization, and sometimes very sort of undemocratic organizational structures that exist within violent or, say, militant organizations, I think that's difficult for people on the left to sort of wrap their head around. So a lot of people on the left in the United States, I think, have an overemphasis on like consensus decision-making capacities, democratic decision-making capacities, regardless of the context. The issue I have is that those kind of decision-making mechanisms are often inadequate, say, in a time of extreme crisis or in, say, a time of militancy. The other issue is that I think the state, in many ways, and here at least I can understand, I think, what Hedges is saying about speaking in the language of violence. Violence is extremely effective, but we do have to deal with the consequences of it. So I can get you to do what I want you to do by putting a gun to your head, but after that, there's going to be consequences. Will you retaliate? If you do retaliate and you do something to me, am I going to do something back to you? And if I do something back to you, is it going to be that much more harsh than what you did to me? And if so, then how are you going to respond? Or how are your friends and family going to respond? This is the sort of cycle that worries me when we start talking about violence before we start or tactics before we start talking about a strategy to actually defeat fascism. And that to me means addressing the many institutions that dominate our society. And I think for better or worse, my experience in the Marine Corps and my experience in the war taught me one of the most fundamental lessons that I could learn as a human being living in the US empire. And that is the US empire is willing to do whatever it takes, including destroying entire nations and ravaging populations and killing people to get what it wants. And I think we really have to understand what it is we're dealing with and really to know our enemy.
I guess the biggest question is, because the US has such a strong culture of violence, and because the state will always defend itself with all of its means, we are up against the largest force, the military force that humanity has ever seen. Can we get to this idea that we build in our communities and in our minds without going through considerable violence to get there?
Well, that's the question I think we're all going to have to ask over the next 10 or 20 years. I think anyone who would come on your program and answer that question with a strict yes or no, I would be very critical, and I would question, where they're coming from. Again, I think for me, I because I've been exposed to extreme violence and because I've seen the impacts of this both among Afghan and Syrian and Iraqi refugees, but then also among the US veterans that I've worked with, many of whom and primarily anti-war veterans, I think we should do everything we can to avoid continuing this cycle of violence. But as you note, and as I noted earlier, I think we also have to understand the context in which we live. A nation of 330 million people built on genocide and slavery, a nation with over 340 million weapons floating around at any given time. I think that it's important for people to recognize that we can create safer communities simply by organizing in a more effective manner, by spending more time with each other, by getting to know each other's families and friends. Those are the kinds of things that are going to build the levels of trust that would then, I think, lead movements and communities to feel more comfortable saying, we've organized for 5 or 10 years together, Eleanor. We've trust each other. We know each other. I know your family. You know my family, or you know my friends. I feel comfortable with you holding a weapon around me. My concern is, whoever's watching this, regardless of what you decide to do in your tactics and in your strategies and so forth, my primary suggestion would be to build organizations and communities on as much trust as possible. If you don't have that trust, then I think things can deteriorate very quickly. And I also think you will find some adventurous. And I think we can't overlook the fact that there are many males in our society who, when they see these kinds of situations, even though they're not committed to their communities on a regular basis, and I have friends who are like this, who then all of a sudden see a situation in Charlottesville, they want to throw on their gear and they're ready to throw down. And my question to some of those folks is, hey man, or hey person, where have you been when we're holding community meetings trying to help single mothers in our community find childcare? Where are you at when we're trying to provide homeless people in our community with food? Now, you've noted that there are many people who do that. I would simply suggest that people do all of the above, and that the only way we're going to effectively create militant defense or even militantly offensive political organizations is by years and years of creating those bonds and that sort of trust.
The idea of self-defense that you mentioned as well. I mean, I feel like when I had a former Black Panther on the show that was talking about the Black Panther model, they were legally walking around their neighborhoods with shotguns, And at the time, those shotguns were pretty much better, if not equally matched to what they might encounter by the most riot cop people that they would meet. But now, I mean, if I have a little gun and I see an MRAP, that's not really going to do me any good. So, I mean, do you
Right.
still feel that this idea, and you mentioned redneck revolt in your article as well, but do you feel that this idea of showing up to a place with guns when you might be confronted with an MRAP or semi-automatic weapons, is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? What are your thoughts on that sort of iteration of self-defense?
Yeah, it's interesting. Look, I would again say that context matters. Showing up to a rally that's pre-planned with permits where the police know you're going to be and they're going to have all the forces in the world to oppose you, and also probably allow the right-wing forces to do what they please, which we saw in Charlottesville. We've seen this throughout history, but nonetheless, I would recommend against that. Here's the deal. Let's say we were in an all-out militant war with the state. Look at what happened in Vietnam. I mean, look at what happened in Iraq. We had the MRAPs, we had all the equipment and high technology and killing machines in the world. But the Vietnamese eventually got rid of us. And I think that eventually the Iraqis and the Afghans and the Syrians will get rid of us. But at what price? And this is the question. 4 million Vietnamese killed, over 4 million, according to the military historian Nick Turse. According to some estimates in Iraq, well over 1 million. If you take Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, combine them, you're talking about probably over 2 million people who have been killed. You have to then sort of devolve into this sort of guerrilla warfare tactics. And again, do I have any kind of moral qualms with that? Not at all. And if it's effective, use it. My concern would be that it's not effective in our current context. And my other concern would be that I don't think we have the organizations ready to do that. And when we're thinking about the militant resistance movements in a place like Iraq or, say, Vietnam, let's take Vietnam, for example, we have to remember that you're talking about a militant resistance movement that had decades, if not a century, of fighting Chinese imperialists, Japanese imperialists, French imperialists, and then American imperialists. So you have entire generations of people, communities, towns, neighborhoods that were structured in such a way to fight that kind of a war. And I just don't think that we are in a position as a series of movements, as an overall left-wing political movement in the United States, to start to show up to rallies like that, or to think that by doing so, we are going to create the kinds of movements or the kinds of resistance that would effectively dismantle the corporate state.
I think it's also interesting, this idea of saying, progress isn't a church, that you're not trying to convert people, because most of the people, and I myself got to this, I was a huge pacifist, very anti-violence, and then through my own research and through my own discussions got to the place where I felt differently. But it wasn't, nobody brought me into the idea of using violence. Nobody personally brought me into that. So this idea that you're not necessarily trying to convert people, you're trying to defend your communities, you have the right as the oppressed to fight back. So in that sense, do you feel like, if push came to shove and we had to is a bit of a odd way of putting it, but if the tactic was on the table and it was a community agreement that, okay, we are going to use property destruction and violence in this particular instance, and people said, oh God, that's awful, would that be a reason to not use it? Or is it the idea that, what, if you're not on board, you might never be on board, and there's nothing I can do about that, but we have to deal with this shit right now?
Yeah, and once again, I think the context matters, and I see these debates taking place in communities of color where I live. So let's say that they're going to come into a Black community here in Michigan City. If the Black community organizations within that community decide, hey, we're going to militantly defend this community at all costs, and this is the route we're going to take, and there's been a good decision-making process leading up to that, then now what the white people in the suburbs say in southern Michigan City or by the beach or whatever, I don't think really matters to me in the short term. If you have to defend yourself in that single instance, then I think that's one thing. But if we're talking about, say, a prolonged sort of struggle, a militant struggle, then I think it might be something different, because I think in that way we will need maybe some people to come in. We're not constantly trying to convert everyone, but I do think that there are plenty of people on the fence who we will need in the long term to build the sort of structures that would hopefully then avoid, or we can then hopefully avoid the situations of having to defend yourself in that single instance.
How do you feel, as particularly with your experience, how do you feel about this sort of like hyper local, sort of flat structure affinity group trying to work with, millions of people at one point? If we're all trying to go towards the same goal of battling capitalism and the patriarchy, in your experience, what is the best way of trying to do that while also not falling prey to those same systems of oppression and hierarchy that the system is using?
Well, I think you have to have built-in structures and mechanisms immediately. So let's say it's an emergency situation. There's white supremacists coming to my town. We're going to organize quickly and effectively to try and stop them. In the midst of that, we drop some of our flat structured democratic decision-making abilities because we have to quickly mobilize and rapidly get people out into the streets. Afterward, I think there's two things you can do. Or that you should do. Number one, reflect on what those structures mean and how we would want to do what are the kinds of things we would want to see in the future, but then to build them into your actual decision-making processes. How do we start building in mechanisms into our institutions to sort of, how would I say this, to demand a constant self-critique and to demand a certain self-reflection that I don't think sometimes people on the left are willing to do. So again, for me, it's situational. I think the ideal is flat structured groups, more egalitarian, more democratic decision making, less authoritarianism, less hierarchy. But for me, at least in our current context, I think we have to be contextual in how we apply that. And so a big challenge that we face is not just internally how we're structuring our organizations and what we're trying to get out to the public, but how we help educate the public and the people who aren't involved or who are just getting involved, who might already have it in their heads that they want a leader or that they want to be a leader or so on. I run into a lot of people, as I'm sure you do, and they tell me, Vince, my opinion doesn't matter, or I don't really know what I'm talking about. And a big part of what I think community organizers, activists, people on the left should be doing is empowering people who are extremely alienated, extremely depressed right now. The state, the culture, the media, they tell everybody they're shit. You're shit. You don't matter. Your opinion doesn't matter. All that really matters is whatever you're buying or whatever you're wearing, or all this kind of stuff. And I really think that our job is to empower people as much. And through empowerment, I think you're going to have a certain deprogramming. But for me, the concept that I like to focus on the most is empowerment. And I think in a hyper individualized, hyper alienated society, there's nothing more powerful than being, I think, empowered. I think a lot of this can make us very dark people. And I think, much like Che Guevara, much like many other people who I've appreciated throughout the years, I operate out of love. I mean, the reason I stopped fighting the war in Iraq was because I came to the realization that I love humanity, regardless of who that person is or where they come from. And I decided to come home and oppose those wars because I loved the planet and I loved people and I wanted to do something about it. It wasn't out of a sense of hatred. It wasn't out of anger. Although I think those emotions are very useful in times, and they can provide a certain level of fuel for your activism or your writing or whatever it is you're doing. But for me, it's a sense of love, and I think we also have to focus on that love and that empowerment.
No, I mean I've written about this too. The idea that self-love is an act of dissent in a system that is fueled off of your hatred of self and of other. Because philosophically speaking, if you recognize that you are a self, and you recognize that that person is an other, then you also have to recognize that they are their own self, and you are their other, and therefore you recognize that we are all selves, and we all have the same ability for self-love and hatred. But in order for you to recognize, in order for me to want my own freedom, I have to also want your freedom, because it's a recognition of my love for myself in you, and that sort of deep philosophical thing that I could get into for the next hours.
Yeah, same here.
But sort of wrapping up here, I want to hear, because in the article you also gave some points that were specific points that I thought was also really interesting, because even though I've read Hedges and I've appreciated a lot what he said, I felt that article was really damaging. But what I really loved about your article was that you were like, hey, It's not about whether I agree with what happened here. Here's just what I saw. From what I saw, here's what I think you could do better, which I really appreciate, that sort of constructive criticism, because I think that's so important. So, yeah, just wrapping up here, what would you say, watching not just Charlottesville, but kind of on a larger scale, what are some ways that we could use the expertise of people that know what real, like, horrendous violence is, and how could that be used to not only make us prepared for potential violence, but also keep us away from that violence?
Well, here I think you can use the knowledge and tactics and skills of former military members who are committed to the movement. If you don't want to be attacked in the street or ambushed or hit by a sniper or so forth, and I know those things sound maybe a little out there right now, but for me, they're not. I mean, I think, again, this brings us back to the point that we should be ahead of the game. And so I think if we see things escalating, we can only assume that they'll continue to escalate. And in that context, I think it would help for people to understand, how do you walk down a street? How do you actually patrol? What kind of groups do you operate within? In the military, we have platoons of 45 people, squads of 12 people, 13 people, with one being a squad leader. We operate in fire teams of 4 people. Each 4-person fire team has a role that supports that 4-person fire team. Each fire team, 3 of which fit within each squad, support that squad. And then 3 squads in a platoon, each squad with 3 4-man fire teams. And how do those 3 squads operate to then benefit a platoon structure of, say, 45 people? Most of the anthropologists that I read, it's clear to them over time that that's like the sort of optimal group number. It's like that we're used to for our 200,000 years, have been operating in these groups of like 45 or 50 people. And I think it's manageable, and I've seen it managed in real time under extremely stressful situations. Now, how do you, as we've been talking about, you don't always want to be in that sort of war mindset, and you don't always want your organization to be structured as such. So then I think the challenge for us is, even if we implement some of those skills and tactics of the military, it is then, how do we then retransition back to a non-military setting?
And with that, we'll wrap up this week's special dose of dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know, because, again, this is a conversation that has to happen. Check out the last slide in the show description to see any sites mentioned in this week's show. And for interim updates, visit us on social media. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and said my shove. I'm not